Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex,
I'm Eve.
and today we're going on a deep dive with a book that's got me thinking a lot.
Thinking a lot. That sounds intriguing.
It is. It really is. It's called Energy, Sex, Suicide, Mitochondria, and the Meaning of Life.
Wow, that's quite a title.
Right. And it's by Nick Lane.
Nick Lane. He's a biochemist who can really tell a story. I've read some of his other work.
Yeah, he really has a way of making even like the tiniest parts of our cells sound fascinating.
Totally. And this book really dives into that, like how these little mitochondria, they're not just the powerhouses of the cell, like we learned in high school.
Right. There's so much more to them.
So much more. He actually starts the book by talking about this huge gap between simple bacteria and the complex cells that make up, us and all the plants and animals.
The deepest evolutionary divide, as he calls it.
Exactly. And he really makes you think, like, bacteria have been around for billions of years. Why haven't they evolved into more complex forms?
That's a good question. What makes eukaryotic cells so special?
Right. Like, what was the key to their success? And that's where the mystery of how eukaryotic cells first arose comes in.
It's not as straightforward as you might think, is it?
Not at all. The traditional view is that they evolved gradually from bacteria, a series of small steps over time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Lane points out some problems with that idea. He even says, if it were that easy, then bacterial cells should have evolved into eukaryotes many times over the past 4 billion years. But that didn't happen.
So it was a one-time thing.
Yeah.
Like lightning struck once.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
And this is where Lane dropped his bombshell. He suggests that this big leap forward was all thanks to the mitochondria.
The mitochondria interstage left.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is they weren't always part of our cells.
They weren't?
Nope. They were once free-living bacteria that got engulfed by another cell billions of years ago.
So basically our cells have these little aliens living inside them.
Kind of. And not just any bacteria. These were bacteria with a special trick up their sleeve.
Okay, what was it?
A way to generate energy using something called a proton gradient across their membrane.
A proton gradient. Now that sounds a little technical.
It's a bit much, but imagine it like this. They built these tiny dams inside themselves to harness the flow of energy, and that's how they powered their cellular processes.
Okay, so they were like little energy factories.
Exactly.
So we've got this ancient cellular merger. But how did this lead to all the complex life we see today? Plants and animals and everything else.
It really comes down to energy. Lane compares energy to currency. The more a cell has, the more it can spend on building complex structures and developing new functions.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So before mitochondria, cells were basically broke.
Pretty much. They were operating on a really tight budget, which limited what they could do.
Okay, so what changed?
Well, when they got mitochondria, it was like they suddenly won the cellular lottery.
Ooh, winning the lottery.
They had all this extra energy to work with. They could finally afford to get bigger pack and more genes and even develop specialized compartments within their cells.
So it's like they upgraded from a tiny studio apartment to a giant mansion.
Exactly. It was a game changer.
This is fascinating. Okay, but Lane also tackles another big question in this book. Why do we have two sexes? What's the link between that and mitochondria?
Well, remember how we said that mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in the nucleus of the cell?
Yeah, that's mind-blowing in itself.
Right. And here's the thing, that mitochondrial DNA is passed down only through the mother's egg cell.
So like that whole idea of mitochondrial Eve?
Exactly. All mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to a single female ancestor.
Wow, that's amazing. But how does this explain why we have males and females?
Lane argues it's all about quality control. Having two sexes ensures that only one parent contributes the mitochondria. It's like a bottleneck that allows natural selection to get rid of any dysfunctional mitochondrial genes.
So it's a way to guarantee that only the best, most efficient mitochondria get passed down to the next generation.
Precisely. And this just shows how crucial energy is in shaping evolution. It's not just about survival of the fittest, but survival of the most energy efficient.
That's a whole new way of looking at it. So these little mitochondria are basically pulling the strings of evolution, shaping the very fabric of life.
It's really something else. And that's just the beginning.
Lane goes on to connect mitochondria to some even crazier stuff like aging and even death.
Okay, we need to dive deeper into those connections, but maybe after we catch our breath. This is a lot to take in. All right, we're back, and my mind is still blown by all this talk about mitochondria and evolution.
Yeah, it's really amazing how these tiny organelles have had such a huge impact on life as we know it.
Absolutely. But you mentioned something earlier about aging and death. how do mitochondria fit into that picture?
Well, this is where things get a little bit darker,
Mm.
but just as fascinating.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued.
So Lane argues that aging and death aren't just inevitable wear and tear. They're actually programmed into our cells.
Programmed? You mean like there's a timer in our cells that tells them when to die? Kind of. It's more like a built-in self-destruct mechanism. And guess who plays a key role in this?
Let me guess. The mitochondria.
Bingo. They're not only responsible for generating energy, but also for releasing signals that trigger cell death. Lane actually calls it programmed suicide.
Whoa, suicide, that's a pretty strong word. But why would our cells want to self-destruct?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Individual cells are expendable. What really matters is the survival of the whole organism.
So sometimes sacrificing a few cells can benefit the whole system.
Exactly. It's like pruning a tree to make it stronger and healthier overall.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do the mitochondria know when to flip that switch? When to trigger cell death?
It's complicated, but it's closely linked to the health and efficiency of the mitochondria themselves.
Okay.
Remember those free radicals we talked about earlier? Those highly reactive molecules produced as a byproduct of energy production.
Yeah, they're like the exhaust fumes of the cellular power plant.
Right. And while some free radicals are needed for cell signaling, too many can cause damage to DNA proteins and other important parts of the cell.
So it's like the power plant starts spewing out too much pollution.
Exactly. And this damage builds up over time. When it reaches a critical point, the mitochondria release signals that activate the cell's self-destruct sequence.
It's like a safety mechanism. When things get too messy, it's time to shut the whole operation down.
That's a great way to put it. And this process is essential for preventing the spread of damage and keeping the organism healthy.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Between generating the energy we need to live and managing the damage that comes with it.
Absolutely. And this brings up an interesting question. Does breathing actually damage us? Since we're constantly producing free radicals just by breathing.
That's a thought-provoking question. Does Lane address that in the book?
He does. He says, does breathing really damage us? The answer is undoubtedly yes. We know that animals which breathe less live longer.
So it's a trade-off. We need oxygen to live, but it's also slowly killing us.
In a way, yes. But Lane argues that the key is to optimize mitochondrial function, to make them as efficient as possible at generating energy while minimizing the production of those harmful free radicals.
Okay, so how do we do that? Is there a magic pill we can take?
I wish. But Lane suggests that exercise might be the closest thing we have.
Exercise. Really?
Yeah, he writes, exercise seems to make the whole system run more efficiently, reducing free radical leakage even as respiration speeds up.
So use it or lose it applies to mitochondria too.
Exactly. Exercise pushes those mitochondria, making them adapt and become more efficient. And that means fewer free radicals, less damage, and potentially a longer lifespan.
Wow, so maybe the fountain of youth isn't a magical spring, it's a treadmill.
Possibly. It really changes how you think about aging. It's not just about avoiding damage, but actively promoting cellular health and resilience.
This is all fascinating.
Yeah.
But if our cells are constantly dying off, how do we stay alive?
Well, alongside this programmed death, there's also constant cell renewal. Our bodies are incredibly dynamic, with cells constantly dividing and replacing themselves.
So it's a constant cycle of life and death happening at a microscopic level.
Exactly. And this process, too, is influenced by those amazing mitochondria.
So they're not just the powerhouses and the suicide triggers. They're also involved in creating new life.
That's right. And Lane argues that this whole dance between creation and destruction is not random. It's been shaped by evolution to maximize the chances of survival and reproduction.
Okay, so this brings us back to sex, right? Didn't we already cover that? The whole mitochondrial Eve thing?
Yeah, but there's another layer to this story. Lane suggests that the very reason we have sex, as opposed to other forms of reproduction, is tied to these unique challenges posed by mitochondria.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How so?
Well, remember how we said that mitochondria have their own DNA separate from the DNA in the nucleus? This actually creates a potential conflict.
A conflict between the two types of DNA.
Exactly. The nuclear genes and the mitochondrial genes aren't always on the same page. They might have different goals, so to speak.
It's like having two CEOs in a company, each with their own agenda.
Perfect analogy. And this conflict can be especially tricky for females. Remember, when a sperm fertilizes an egg, it only contributes its nuclear DNA. The mitochondria in the offspring come entirely from the mother.
So the females are stuck with whatever mitochondria they inherit, no matter what.
Pretty much. And that puts a lot of pressure on females to choose mates with healthy, efficient mitochondria. After all, those mitochondria are going to be passed down to their offspring, and they want to give their kids the best possible start.
So the females are like the ultimate quality control inspectors when it comes to mitochondria.
Exactly. And Lane argues that this need to select for good mitochondria was a major driving force in the evolution of sexual reproduction.
It's like natural selection saying, let's shuffle the deck and see if we can get a better hand when it comes to energy production.
That's a great way to put it. And this just highlights how profoundly mitochondria have shaped the very structure of life. They're not just passive passengers in our cells. They're active participants in our evolution, our behavior, and even our destiny.
So we've talked about how important mitochondria are for so many things, energy production, aging,
Yeah.
even sex. But there's one thing we haven't really addressed yet. How did this whole merger happen in the first place? How did a bacterium end up inside another cell and become the mitochondria?
Yeah, that's the big mystery, isn't it? The origin of the eukaryotic cell. It's one of the biggest questions in evolutionary biology.
And I remember you mentioned earlier that Lane isn't a fan of the traditional explanation.
Right. The idea that a proto-eukaryote, a kind of complex cell, just engulfed a bacterium and poof, mitochondria. But he argues that's incredibly unlikely.
Yeah, he called it a hopeful monster. So what's his alternative?
Well, Lane prefers something called the hydrogen hypothesis.
The hydrogen hypothesis. Okay, remind me how that one works.
Sure. So imagine the world billions of years ago before there was much oxygen around, just a bunch of simple, single-celled organisms hanging out.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And in this world, you've got an archaeon, a type of cell that's different from bacteria, and it needs hydrogen for energy. And then there's this bacterium that just happens to produce hydrogen as a byproduct of its metabolism.
Ah, so they're a perfect match.
Exactly. The archaeon needs what the bacterium is making, so they team up living close together and sharing resources. Lane calls it a marriage of convenience.
So it's like this ancient power grid. The bacterium is the power plant, and the archaeon is using the energy.
Perfect analogy. Now imagine that over time, this partnership gets even closer. The bacterium actually gets absorbed by the archaeon. It moves, basically taking up residence inside the cell membrane.
So this is how it became the mitochondria.
That's the idea. And what's cool about this is that it explains why mitochondria are so good at producing energy. You know that proton gradient we talked about?
90 dams.
Right. Well, that mechanism was already present in the bacterium before it got swallowed up.
So this ancient bacterial system became the foundation for energy production in all complex life.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I know, right? And it explains why this merger was such a unique event. It wasn't just any random bacterium. It had to have that specific machinery for energy production already in place.
And this is why Lane thinks that without this chance meeting, without this hydrogen-powered partnership complex, life might never have happened.
Exactly. He writes, the hydrogen hypothesis is the only credible explanation for how eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes. It's a bold statement, but it shows just how important energy is for the whole story of life.
It's incredible to think that we owe our very existence to this ancient partnership, this random encounter billions of years ago.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? And it makes you appreciate the interconnectedness of all living things. We're all descended from that first eukaryotic cell, that improbable fusion that led to the incredible diversity of life we see today.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. It's made me see mitochondria in a whole new light. They're not just these little powerhouses. They're the architects of complexity, the drivers of evolution, and the guardians of life itself.
I agree. And Lane has such a talent for making these complex scientific ideas understandable and exciting. Energy, sex, suicide isn't just a science book. It's a philosophical exploration, what it means to be alive.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Huh?
I highly recommend this book to anyone who's curious about the origins of life, the evolution of complexity, or even just the mysteries of our own existence. It's a journey into the microscopic world that will leave you with a sense of wonder and awe at the intricate tapestry of life.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners with a final thought from Nick Lane himself. He writes, life is a relentless struggle for energy, a struggle that shapes the grand sweep of evolution. Something to ponder, isn't it?
It definitely is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into energy, sex, suicide. Thanks for joining us.
This is Alex and Eve.
Until next time, keep those notes of curiosity flowing.